What's up, guys? Chapter 25 vocabulary. Yalta Conference was the last big sit down between Winston Churchill, FDR, and Stalin. Stalin promised free, fair, and open elections for Poland. These two, Churchill and FDR, promised Stalin that he could have a sphere of influence in Eastern Europe, right? But this guy did promise for Poland to get free, fair, and open elections. Also, they said they would divide up Germany into zones, with the Eastern Europe being part of the Soviet Union, or not part of the Soviet Union, but part of the Soviet sphere of influence, and then the West being under the Western Europe. It would be like a Western Europe type of democracy. So there's that. Also, they created the UN, and yeah, that's the Yalta Conference. Polish elections promised by this guy. Also, these guys said he could have a sphere of influence in Eastern Europe. Also, UN. Speaking of UN, United Nations, this is going to be a body of basically all of the countries in the world coming together. Like, they're basically going to come together, send representatives to this body, and yeah, you're going to have five founding members. So basically, the five countries that helped to win World War II, your five major powers that won World War II: Britain, the United States, France, even though they lost early in the war, China, and the Soviet Union. Those five founding members, they get to have a veto vote on like anything the United Nations does. Today, the United Nations is still around, and they still try to like do stuff, provide aid, prevent wars, and stuff like that. But it's very difficult to get the United Nations to like actually do anything, because you literally have the Soviet Union, now Russia, and China on this, like, as part of the same thing. They both have this veto vote in the United Nations, same as Britain, France, and the United States. And so getting all five of those countries today to agree on something, say like a human rights issue, is very difficult, because China and Russia both don't have the best human rights records, and so they are not always, or they rarely take an interest in preventing human rights abuses. So yeah, there's that. But they did create the United Nations right after World War II. Yeah, United Nations. Every country has a representative there, but the five founding nations, U.S., Britain, France, China, and the Soviet Union, they each have a veto vote, where if one of them votes no, then it's a no, and the United Nations doesn't do that. And that's the United Nations. Also, another term you need to know is the Potsdam Conference. Potsdam Conference, the Potsdam one, is going to be the one that Harry Truman attends in this Potsdam Conference. This is where Truman tries to push Stalin around and tell Stalin how the post-war world is going to function. So there's that. Also, Stalin agreed not to like steal money and demand reparations from Germany, except for the part of Germany that was in the Soviet zone. So yeah, there's that, and then just more details on how Germany was going to be divided up. Truman here is going to offhand, like in some offhand remarks, talk to Stalin and try and tell Stalin, hey, we have this large weapon, the biggest weapon that's ever been used ever. And he was like trying to like hint to him that they had the atomic bomb without actually telling him about the atomic bomb. Stalin already knew about it, but Truman tries to kind of push Stalin around by telling him about the bomb, even though Stalin already knew about the bomb. But Truman did not know that yet. So anyways, that's the Potsdam Conference. Containment is just in general. That is when the United States tries to contain communism, right? So they go anywhere, any country in the world that is in danger of turning to communism. The United States would send money, they would send food, they would send aid. They might later on, once we get into the 50s and 60s and 70s, the United States might send military assistance or just use the military to prevent countries from turning to communism. Containment is just the policy where the United States would go anywhere in the world to prevent countries from turning communist, to contain communism from spreading into those countries, right? So yeah, there's that. Containment is going to come about because this guy George Kennan sent the long telegram. George Kennan sent the long telegram where he was basically explaining that in Western Europe, the Soviet Union was trying to take over and was trying to spread. And so, yeah, he, in this long telegram, warned America that they needed to contain communism. And for the rest of the Cold War, the United States is going to do that policy where they try to contain communism. So yeah, there's that, and that is what containment is. Um, right, in the first instance where the United States is going to actually practice containment is going to be the Truman Doctrine. 1947, Britain was out of money. Greece and Turkey were in danger of turning to communism, and so Truman is going to allocate, with the help of Congress, $400 million for Greece and Turkey. So $400 million to Greece and Turkey, and that is the Truman Doctrine. Right, it's going to be containment. They sent them. They sent Greece and Turkey money and aid, and Greece and Turkey did not turn communist because of the Truman Doctrine. So, what's an example of containment? The first example historically in 1947, the next year after the Long Telegram, would be the Truman Doctrine, which allocated $47 million in aid to Greece and Turkey to prevent them from turning communist. So, there's that. Next one, Marshall Plan. A bigger example, a more substantive example with like a larger dollar sign or with a much larger number of dollars going towards it, was the Marshall Plan. Marshall Plan started in 1948. This is going to involve a bunch of more money. This is $13 billion. So like the Truman Doctrine, just way more, 13 billion instead of 400 million. And this is not just going to go to Greece and Turkey. This is going to go to a bunch of Western European countries, and that is the Marshall Plan, right? So Marshall Plan, we're talking about $13 billion going to Western Europe to help them rebuild after World War II. So there's that. One country that was not super happy about the Marshall Plan was the Soviet Union. They didn't want Eastern European countries taking Marshall Plan money and getting any ideas about turning to capitalism. So, in response, the Soviet Union put a blockade around all of West Berlin, which was deep inside the eastern part of Germany. And in response, with West Berlin completely surrounded, the United States, Britain, West Germany, France, they decided to, instead of just letting West Berlin completely starve and get overrun by the communists and fall to communism, they decided to keep the city completely supplied via airplanes, right? And so for months and months and months and months, the United States, Britain, France, West Germany, they supplied the western half of Berlin completely by airplane. Every loaf of bread they ate, every piece of coal that they burned throughout the winter to keep warm was flown in by airplane. It took a lot of planning. It was pretty epic, and yeah, I highly recommend that you do some more research on the Berlin airlift. Also, sometimes these planes drop candy, and that's why these kids are all like waving at it. Also, this is propaganda for the West in favor of capitalism. But yeah, that was the Berlin airlift when they supplied an entire city for months and months and months just via airplane, and that was the Berlin airlift. After these Western European countries had worked together so well, pulling off the Berlin airlift, they decided that it would be a good idea if they formed a peacetime alliance, and that's exactly going to be what they did. They called it the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. It's still around today. It's called NATO. And yeah, it's basically going to be your Western European countries, countries that are, in general, democracies, countries that are capitalist. And basically, if any one of these Western European countries got attacked, say France got attacked or Britain got attacked, then it would. The end result would be all the NATO countries coming to their aid to keep them from turning communist or to just protect them from whatever attack had attacked them. And that's NATO. So if you're thinking military alliance, during the Cold War of Western European democracies, that is going to be NATO. So there's that. The communist side, the Soviet Union led side, wasn't going to just sit there and let the capitalists make a military alliance. The communist side is also going to make a military alliance, and they called theirs the Warsaw Pact, right? So if we're talking about like Eastern European countries uniting together into a big military alliance, we're talking about 1955, the Warsaw Pact, right? So we're talking like Poland, Eastern Germany, all of these Soviet satellite countries, the Soviet Union and stuff, they were all part of the Warsaw Pact. What's the Western European side? The capitalists, what was their military alliance? That was NATO. What was the communist military alliance? That was the Warsaw Pact. Warsaw Pact. All right, here we go. Mao Zedong. This is the Chinese leader of the Communist Party. The Communist Party won the civil war that had been going on before, during, and after. World War II. And yeah, he's going to be like the Chinese leader in the 50s, the Chinese leader in the 60s. Bunch of crazy stuff happened under Mao Zedong. Definitely, you should definitely do your own research into Mao Zedong. Great leap forward. Chinese Cultural Revolution with teenagers rising up and killing their teachers and stuff like that. He met with Nixon whenever Nixon went and opened up China and stuff like that. Mao Zedong is like a super, super, super pivotal historical figure. And yeah, that's Mao Zedong, communist leader, and the communists in won the Chinese Civil War in 1949. All right, Korean War. Korean War is going to go from 1950 to 1953. Korean War 1950 to 1953. And yeah, basically at the time, the Soviet Union was boycotting the United Nations because the United States didn't recognize communist China, and also North Korea invaded South Korea. And so, with the Soviet Union gone and China, us not recognizing communist China as being the actual China, the United Nations is going to get together with the United States, and mostly with the leadership of the United States. They're going to fight this 3 year long war. And in the end, there was very little change in the borders. Before the Korean War, the border between North Korea, which was communist, and South Korea, which was capitalist, was the 38th parallel. After the Korean War, it's still going to be the 38th parallel dividing North Korea and South Korea. Those two countries are still divided by that line today, and there's like literally huge armies on either side with guns pointed at the other side, and so it's still kind of technically going on. Anyways, yeah, North Korea, or the Korean War rather, that was a thing, and that happened. All right, next one, Taft-Hartley Act. Going back to the domestic front, like inside of the United States, the Taft-Hartley Act is going to be this anti-union law. This is going to partially get rid of some of the key protections that labor unions got with the National Labor Relations Act back in 1935, also known as the Wagner Act. So so Taft-Hartley Act is going to partially get rid of some of these labor union laws, or some of the protections labor unions got with the Wagner Act. It's going to make it much more difficult to organize workers. Also, states are going to be allowed to pass right to work laws. And in these right to work laws, basically, it's going to be much harder for unions to like grow into like it's basically employers are going to be able to hire workers that are not part of unions. This is getting rid of this closed shop unionism practices that labor unions were able to do after the Wagner Act was passed. So yeah, what's an example of the United States getting kind of conservative and passing a conservative Republican supported law after World War II? That would be the Taft-Hartley Act. 1947 undid some of the Wagner Act laws. Labor unions were still big in the late 40s and 50s, but they're going to be weakened in the long term. They're going to be weakened by the Taft-Hartley Act. So there's that. All right, the fair deal. This is going to be Truman's domestic policy, right? FDR had the New Deal. Harry Truman had the fair deal. In the fair deal, though, you're going to have a bunch of civil rights components. You're going to have a universal health care law. You're going to have some social security reforms. Is going to expand social security. There's going to be some housing for poor people that they build. Some of that housing did get built. The healthcare law did not get passed, but you did have some expansion of social security. So yeah, the United States tried to do universal healthcare with the fair deal. It failed. Like the fair deal mostly failed. They did not pass the healthcare. You had some social security expansion, and you did have some low income housing that was built. But in general, the fair deal did not really pass. When you think of Harry Truman, you do not think, wow, it's that guy who did the fair deal, right? You think FDR, wow, FDR did the New Deal. When you think of Harry Truman, you're not like, wow, fair deal changed America forever. No, there were some things that were passed, some social security expansion, some housing for the poor. But in general, this is not something that Truman really got done, right? In a large way. You did not have universal health care. That's not going to happen in the United States. Well, technically, it still hasn't completely happened, but the closest the United States came to universal health care was Obamacare, which was passed, after 2008. But Truman tried to do a universal healthcare law with his part of his Fair Deal, but it did not pass. Right? You think Truman? He's more of a Cold Warrior. He's more like an international relations president. Those were his biggest achievements. The Fair Deal in general did not really get passed. All right, so there's that. The loyalty security program. The loyalty security program. This is going to be a thing that Truman starts doing in 1947. That started investigations into suspected communists within the government. So this is like Democrats that are working in the government. And yeah, Truman started this whole process. They started investigating people. A lot of the people that were investigated and lost their jobs were LGBT. So there's that. This is part of this. Part of this loyalty and security program is going to lead to what was called the Lavender Scare, which is like the Red Scare, but it was specifically targeting people who were gay or lesbian in that worked for the government. So there's that. So loyalty security program. This is like the start of the second Red Scare. It's just that it was initiated by Truman. So if you're thinking like, oh, well, how come the Democrats didn't try to like get the communists out of the government before Republicans started accusing them of being communists and stuff? They did, and that was called the loyalty and security program, right? So yeah, loyalty and security program. This is like a self-initiated searching out of communists within the government, led by Harry Truman. So there's that. Now, in the subsequent years after that, there is also going to be a bunch of political fire that Republicans fire at Democrats. In as far as like calling them communists, investigating people for being communists, finding a few communists amongst them. At least the House on Un-American Activities Committee did. Mostly, though, it's political bluster, and their investigations weren't that productive. But the House on Un-American Activities Commission, this is a House committee, meaning that it was made up by members of the House. Quick review: members of the House are elected every 2 years. Members of the House are elected every 2 years. And so, yeah, there's this committee in the House, and they investigated people for being possible communists. One of the biggest groups, or one of their biggest targets, were Hollywood actors, Hollywood film producers. A bunch of people lost their jobs. They would get blacklisted. They would be investigated, and then once they were investigated, they would have to name people that they knew who were communists, and if not, then they faced punishment and stuff like that. So yeah, that was the House on Un-American Activities Commission. Also, its most prominent member that you need to remember, their name is Richard Nixon. Richard Nixon was a member of the House of Representatives, and he was a member of HUAC. He was a member of this House on Un-American Activities Committee, and they went after Hollywood directors, Hollywood actors, and stuff like that. And yeah, it's after this HUAC gets started and is investigating people that you see Hollywood films get like really, really, really anti-communist, like basically late 40s and 1950s. Basically, these Hollywood films, they're all like super, super, super anti-communist. The bad guy is always a communist. You got to make the communist out to be a bad guy. And if you don't do that, then, well, you must be a communist, right? Because the HUAC, they were going after everyone in Hollywood that they possibly could that might have even like neutral communist opinions. So yeah, that's HUAC. All right, now since we're talking about people investigating people for being communists, we've got to talk about Joseph McCarthy. Joseph McCarthy was a senator. Joseph McCarthy was a senator, and he is going to be a huge part of this second Red Scare. He made a lot of accusations of people, accused people of being communists. McCarthy is not going to find people, or he's not going to be successful in finding or proving that people were communists. He did accuse a lot of people, and he probably had more clout and he got more publicity than the HUAC did. But ultimately, McCarthy was less successful. He did not actually prove people to be communists. Also, he accused a lot of people who weren't communists of being communists, and this, like, his actions and what he said, and this whole like witch hunt thing that he carries on for a number of years. they were not communists at all. So there's that. He finally came to an end. Like his whole like witch hunt finally came to an end when he started accusing people in the military of being communists. Some people in the some high-ranking military officers who had been like in charge in Korea, like the Korean War, where they were actually killing communists. And when that is like aired on TV and people see some of the ways that he was nonsensically accusing people and like blustering uh, about things in like an irrational way, he kind of loses a lot of his support. And yeah, once he stepped down, he died a few years after this. He had a really bad drinking problem as well. Anyways, that is Joseph McCarthy. Khrushchev. All right, Khrushchev is going to be this Soviet dictator who takes over after Stalin. He's going to do a bunch of stuff like 50s, 60s. Who was the Soviet leader in the 50s and 60s after Stalin? That's going to be Khrushchev. Khrushchev was a Soviet dictator after Stalin in the 50s and early 60s. So there's that. You're going to have the space race get started under him, right? They put the Sputnik satellite up into space, which is going to freak out a bunch of Americans because the Soviets appeared to be ahead in the space race. You're going to have this massive like thing happened where they shot down a U.S. spy plane that the U.S. thought was flying too high for the Soviets to be able to shoot it down. They shot that down, and he kind of made Eisenhower look like he was lying, because he was lying about this spy plane that was up there. It was the U-2 incident. Also, the Berlin Wall. Also, you had under Khrushchev, the Cuban Missile Crisis. Ultimately, Kennedy kind of appeared to get the better of him in the Cuban Missile Crisis, and he appeared to be weak. He wasn't actually weak, and Kennedy didn't actually get the better of him in the Cuban Missile Crisis, but that's what it appeared to be to the Americans. And so, yeah, he's going to lose power after the Cuban Missile Crisis. But yeah, bunch of stuff happened under Khrushchev in the 50s and 60s. So yeah, Khrushchev, Soviet dictator after Stalin, did a series of went through a series of programs to he called de-Stalinization, space race, Berlin Wall, Cuban Missile Crisis, all of that. For all of that stuff, he was the Soviet dictator, and so there's that. All right, new look. The new look is going to be basically this like reliance on atomic weapons and the buildup of America's atomic capacity. Also, the expansion of America's atomic capacity to allow the United States to also make hydrogen bombs. This is going to be an Eisenhower thing. Eisenhower was like, look, at armies are really big, tanks are really they're really big, they're really expensive. That costs a lot of money. We need to like do less of that and do more of this like building up of nuclear bombs. So yeah, basically Eisenhower was like, armies are expensive. Let's make nukes. Nukes are cheaper. It's cheaper to make a bunch of nukes and sit there and threaten people with nuclear bombs and even hydrogen bombs. Hydrogen bombs are way bigger than just nuclear bombs. It's way cheaper to do that than to like put together an army of like 100,000 people, 200,000 people in Western Europe and pay them to like sit there and wait for a war to break out. So yeah, new look involves building up America's nuclear capacity. Also associated with new look, after the U.S. pursues this new look policy of building up its atomic bombs, you get past the 1950s, you get this other term, MAD, which was mutually assured destruction, right? With everyone, if both the Soviet Union and the United States had tons of nuclear bombs, tons of fusion bombs, the hydrogen bombs, if one side had started nuking the other side would have started nuking the other side back. All biological life on Earth would have ended, and yeah, because the destruction would have been assured, and it would have been mutual. Both sides would have destroyed each other if they had started nuking each other. So there's that. But yeah, once the United States starts creating nuclear bombs and hydrogen bombs, the Soviet Union is going to try to catch up. This is going to lead to a nuclear arms race, where both sides are trying to produce the best weapons. As we start learning stuff about the space race, the veil, like the space race was like a very thin veil covering this arms race, because if you could put a man on the moon, or if you could put a satellite orbiting the Earth, you could also build a rocket powerful enough to fly a bomb across an ocean, right? And that's exactly what they were designing. All right, yeah, and that is the arms race. Moving on, the CIA in the 1940s. The CIA is going to be created basically to counter communism. This is going to be the main agency that does like spying on the Soviet Union, or they're going to try to spy on the Soviet Union. They're going to go into developing countries that are in danger of turning communist, and they are going to spy on what the communists are doing there. Also, sometimes they didn't just spy, sometimes they would do espionage, sometimes they would actually overturn a government, right? Officially, they've never like acknowledged like assassinations or whatever, but they would put in place dictators if the dictators were like hard on communists and were like right wing leaning, or at least capitalist, and like the type of rhetoric that they did. So sometimes they'll do regime change, right? Iran, Guatemala. These are things. Those are both countries where the CIA toppled an existing government and replaced it with a more pro-American, anti-communist regime in Iran and Guatemala. And yeah, that's the CIA. So there's that. One of the first operations the CIA did was in Italy. Not so much like a regime change, but you did have guys show up in Italy with suitcases full of cash to pay for a politician's campaign. They were campaigning against a communist politician, and they got American Italians to like write letters home and stuff like that, suitcases back to Italy, telling people not to vote for the communists. And yeah, CIA spy agency went out, spied on people, and prevented countries from turning communist. That's the CIA. All right, Ho Chi Minh. This is going to be the communist leader in Vietnam during the first part of the Vietnam War. Also, he was at the League of Nations and tried to ask the French to allow Vietnam to become a country, to which the French at the League of Nations said no, which was not a great plan on their part. Later on, this guy's going to start leading an independence movement against the French. The Americans started helping out the French, fighting against Ho Chi Minh's forces, and ultimately, the United States gets dragged into this whole Vietnam War thing. So who's the leader of the Vietnamese communists? That would be Ho Chi Minh. Ho Chi Minh was the leader of the Vietnamese communists. Ho Chi Minh, leader of the Vietnamese communists. So there's that. 1950s, under Eisenhower, basically Eisenhower claims that if one part of East Asia falls to communism, then like the rest of the countries would fall to communism, right? The idea is if Vietnam falls to communism, then Laos will also fall to communism, which will make Cambodia fall to communism, which will make Thailand, and then Burma, and then maybe India and Bangladesh. All of those countries might all fall to communism. So you've got to stop communism from happening in Vietnam, or the rest of them will fall. This is like the ultimate like go-to justification for containment at all cost in the Cold War. Stop them here, or they will spread everywhere, and then we'll be fighting communists in the United States. And that's the domino theory. All right, the Eisenhower Doctrine is going to basically take the containment idea to the Middle East, right? So Eisenhower Doctrine, containment in the Middle East. Eisenhower Doctrine, containment in the Middle East. The CIA under Eisenhower is going to do regime change in Iran. They're going to switch, or they are going to overthrow the government of Iran and replace them with a more pro-American government in Iran. And so, this Eisenhower Doctrine took containment to the Middle East. Right before that, it had been in East Asia with the Korean War. It had also obviously been in Europe with the Marshall Plan and Truman Doctrine. Eisenhower takes containment and takes it to the Middle East. And that is the Eisenhower Doctrine, right? John F. Kennedy, he's going to be elected president in 1960, took office in 1961, youngest president ever elected. So there's that. He's going to be president during some of the most epic early, 1960s Cold War events. So like the Berlin Wall going up, also the Bay of Pigs, also the Cuban Missile Crisis, when all biological life on Earth almost ended. So there's that. And that was John F. Kennedy. Also, just for future chapters, when this guy was elected, he promised promised in his campaign to do civil rights. He promised to do that. Did he actually do civil rights when he was elected? No, he was busy with stuff like the Berlin Wall, also the Bay of Pigs, also the Cuban Missile Crisis. So it never really happened. But he was assassinated in 1963, and then after that, you're going to have LBJ take over, and LBJ both accelerated the Vietnam War, but then LBJ, the guy that came after him, also started doing civil rights stuff. But yeah, John F. Kennedy, we're talking Bay of Pigs, Cuban Missile Crisis, and Berlin Wall. So there's that. Fidel Castro, he's going to be the communist dictator of Cuba. He took over in the Cuban Revolution in the 1950s in Cuba. So there's that. If you're looking for an example of Eisenhower's presidency failing to contain communism, look no further than Fidel Castro and Cuba, the Cuban Revolution, as they took over Cuba throughout the 1950s. And that was, Fidel Castro, Cuban dictator. They had all kinds of crazy plans to try and get this guy removed from power, all kinds of assassination plots that the CIA thought of. There was all kinds of assassination plots the CIA thought of to get rid of him. Some of them were kind of crazy. Literally, one of them involved trying to drug some of the food that he ate with not necessarily a poison, although there were plans to poison him as well, but with a drug specifically that would make his beard fall out, as if making Castro's beard fall out would somehow like make him lose power in Cuba. That doesn't quite make sense. Like, I don't know why a guy's beard falling out would make him like lose political power if he's like the dictator of a country. But the CIA had they put people in charge of like thinking of a way to make his beard fall out. So yeah, there's that. And he's Fidel Castro. Also, Bay of Pigs. One of the attempts to get him out of power was called the Bay of Pigs, and basically the Eisenhower administration thought up this way to where they would train former Cubans, like people who had fled Cuba during the Cuban Revolution, to do like a mini D-Day invasion of Cuba, and they promised them some air support, some U.S. air support. The U.S. was going to like fly planes over and like bomb Cuba while they did like this little mini D-Day invasion of Cuba. The idea was that people hated it under communism and that they would like rise up from the countryside and like help these Cubans who were doing this like Bay of Pigs invasion, which was supposed to be like a small D-Day invasion. It did not work out that way. The Cubans did not rise up in rebellion and support the Bay of Pigs invasion. Also, the United States didn't want to start World War III, so that air support that was supposed to happen like never happened. And Eisenhower thought it up, but it happened in 1961 under this brand new super young president, John F. Kennedy. Right, this guy was really young. Eisenhower, remember, was the guy who had thought up the D-Day invasion, or he was the one who was in charge of the D-Day invasion back during World War II. Also, JFK was a Democrat. He didn't want to look weak on communism and stuff. He's doing that Cold War liberalism. So JFK went ahead and did the Bay of Pigs. It completely failed. It really, really, really failed, and it was really bad. And it's going to, down the road, kind of indirectly lead to the Cuban Missile Crisis. Speaking of the Cuban Missile Crisis, there was this massive nuclear standoff where the Soviet Union had been moving nuclear missiles into Cuba. While it was technically possible for Russia to nuke the United States by 1962 using missiles that were launched from the Soviet Union, it definitely had missiles that could reach the United States from Cuba, and they could do so much more accurately, and they had way more missiles that could reach the United States from Cuba, because that's a lot shorter flight from Cuba to the United States. Also, the warning time that the United States would have about missiles flying towards it would be like 5 minutes tops. And so, Cuban missiles going into Cuba, or Soviet missiles going into Cuba, was definitely not something that the United States could do. They blockaded it. There was almost World War III. If World War III had happened, literally everyone on Earth would have died because of all the nuclear fallout that would have happened and the radiation and stuff. It did not end. And it did not end that way. World War III was avoided. Kennedy looked pretty slick. Khrushchev did not look so slick. The United States had to secretly remove missiles that it had in Turkey. The Soviet Union had to remove its missiles from Cuba. And yeah, Khrushchev is going to gradually lose power after that. The next year after that, though, in 1963, Kennedy was assassinated. So I don't know who's really winning. But the United States definitely came off as being like the one that got the better deal out of the Cuban Missile Crisis. But I think everyone got a good deal because we didn't all die, or people didn't all die on planet Earth. So there's that. Also, under Kennedy's administration, he's going to come up with this program called the Peace Corps, which was supposed to help do some containment stuff indirectly by sending college-educated Americans to developing countries to build stuff like windmills to pump water out of wells, and to provide healthcare, basic education to people in developing nations and stuff. Was it that effective? Not really. It wasn't that effective, but the people who were in the Peace Corps got some really good real life experience, helping people in the developing world. And it's an example of a non-military peaceful organization that was supposed to help people in developing country, also help them to the point where they wouldn't turn to communism. And yeah, chapter 25 vocabulary.